Hey, so in chapters 2 and 3, we cover a lot of ground, so I'll get right to it. Chapter 2 is 1861, so it covers the time up to Lincoln's assumption of office in March of 1861 through the end of that year. Before that, we have Andrew Buchanan, the incumbent in office in the White House, who kind of, although he's probably a Southern sympathizer, he deems himself pretty powerless to do anything against the seceding states because he deems it their right to secede. So for the first couple months of the hostilities, we don't really have anything happen, and then Lincoln takes office, and the Battle of Fort Sumter happens, which is the Confederates storming the Union fort in, I think, South Carolina, and he's immediately thrust into a wartime presidency role, and Lincoln will prove a much more decisive and active leader, and he'll ultimately expand the role of the executive more than any president in history to that point, and probably isn't surpassed until FDR. He's a commander-in-chief in the truest sense, in that he's really a hands-on general. He's constantly keeping up with the war efforts, writing generals, talking about troop movements. There's a lot of funny quotes from letters that he writes. He replaces generals, I believe, 3 times in the 2 chapters, from George McClellan, who will eventually go on to run against him in the election of 1864 and lose in a landslide, to Ulysses' ultimate surrender, U.S. Grant, who is the guy who will eventually lead the Union Army to victory. Then in the South, we talk a little bit about their leadership. Jefferson Davis, who is almost immediately elected president down there. We talk quite a bit about battles. We start with the Battle of Antietam, which is a big Union disaster. There's thousands of troops dead. Manassas is another disaster, and after that is when Lincoln decides that he's got to make a move, and he starts replacing generals. Through this point, an interesting footnote is that Lincoln didn't talk much about didn't talk much about slavery at all. Yeah, I'm doing homework for a class. Lincoln didn't talk much about slavery at all, or didn't conflate the Union cause with slavery until much later in the war, when he deemed it would actually not only that it would be something that was possible to pass, but that was something that was politically helpful, that he could eventually draw more volunteer troops into the army. And he issues the Emancipation Proclamation in the New Year's of 1863, and the Union Army is now fighting to free the slaves. Should they win the war, all the slaves would be freed. All slaves in free states are freed, and in Washington, D.C. By the end of chapter 3, the Union Army is pretty squarely winning the war. What's his name? Who's the guy who goes down to Georgia? He takes Atlanta before the election of 1864. So the Union Army is good shape by the time we wrap up this chapter. So that's pretty much what I got.